I want to look now at the evolution of Chinese civilization from about the year 5000 BC down to about the year 200 BC, which will terminate with the period of the rise of the first great Chinese empire, the so-called Qin Empire, that was put together by the emperor, China's first great emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. But what I want to do is show the evolution of Chinese civilization in this counterplay between the cult of the ancestors versus technological innovation, which in China, China is the great ancestor worshiping cult civilization par excellence. And indeed, in that civilization, the cult of the ancestral dead, filial piety, respect for one's elders, is the primary form of religiosity and always has been in that civilization. So if any civilization should provide a test case in which the floraison of the cult of the ancestors and its weakening would then lead to an opening to change and innovation, this should be the test case that should prove the rule that I'm postulating here. So let's go back to the beginning of Chinese civilization with the Yangshao culture. And once again, here we're going to start with two cultures, the opposition between the Yangshao culture, which is a farmer culture that dates from between 5000 to 3000 BC, and the Lungshan culture, which comes in between 3000 and 2000, which is a militaristic culture. But now let's look at the burial site here, an interesting cemetery at the site of Shichia. This is a Yangshao site in Weinan, which is in Shenxi province, dating back to 5000 BC. We find this cemetery with a series of square-shaped pits laid out into rows. Now, one of these pits features the neatly organized remains of about 26 individuals. Inside the pit, the dead were laid out into 4 rows of between 5 and 8 people, while the bones of each individual were completely disarticulated and folded up into a compact pile with the skull placed neatly like a bow on top. The bones are not intermingled with each other but kept carefully separate. These are secondary burials, which means that at one time these people were buried someplace else, probably under the house floor, and when, after the flesh had rotted away from the bones, the remains were then dug up and placed here into this communal cemetery. Now, according to Chinese microcosmology, the human subtle body was composed of 2 elements, a Hun soul and a Po soul. The Hun soul was associated with the breath and the voice and with intelligence, and it was generally given a masculine valency, yang, and was linked with the heavens, while the Po soul was linked with the circulation of the blood and the vital organs and the lower animal nature. It was therefore yin, or earthly, in terms of its valency. Now at death, the Po soul was regarded as going down into the earth, where it took up its residence as a shade in the Chinese underworld, a realm known as the Yellow Springs, while the Hun soul then went up towards the heavens. Now, if you wanted to reanimate the ancestors, what you had to do was you had to coax these 2 souls back together to meet each other. Since the human individual in the Chinese cosmology is basically a fusion or a union of heavenly and earthly powers. So you might put some black millet on the ground that would entice the Po soul to come up out of the Yellow Springs, and then you might burn some animal fat mixed with wormwood to give off odorous smoke that travels up to the heavens to attract the Hun soul. And once the 2 are joined back together, then the ancestor is there, and you can now commune with him or her, and ask them whatever you want, whatever the question is. Now, the Hun soul also happened to be linked to a special type of tablet called a Shen Chu that was placed in the temple or the hall of the ancestors, where rows of these tablets were lined up on steps. Each tablet was about 12 inches long and 3 inches wide, and it bore the name and the date of birth of the dead ancestor. So now, if we look back at the linear rows of the dead in this Yangshao cemetery, we can already see there's a fundamental connection between the way the dead were organized at this Yangshao farmer cultural cemetery and the rows of the tablets of the dead that are organized in linear fashion in the halls of the ancestors. There's a direct relationship to them. The dead at the Yangshao site were normally laid out on an east-west axis with the head pointing to the west. But in South China, this was in North China. In South China, the dead tended to be lined up on a north-south axis. We've already seen the dead lined on an east-west axis at Mehrgarh in India, and then on a north-south axis later at Harappa. And so the Chinese believed that if their ancestors were properly revered, then they would bring, if they weren't properly revered, I should say, they would bring down curses, misfortune, and calamity. Properly worshipped, they would bestow gifts and prosperity. So everything in Chinese society that befalls the individual, good luck or bad, wealth or happiness, is a direct function of whether you have a good or a bad relationship with your ancestors. So the relationship with the ancestors is absolutely the fundamental thing. Now, filial piety is directly rooted. This is filial piety is respect for one's elders. It's directly rooted in this Chinese cult of ancestor worship, which is in strong contrast, of course, to the modern West, where the goal is to get rid of one's elders, one's parents, as quickly as possible. And I think it's not going too far in saying that for the Chinese, the wise old man is the central archetype of their civilization. Because if you look at the Chinese pantheon of gods, there are no young men whatsoever in these gods. They're all elderly. Lao Tzu, the name Lao Tzu means old master. They're all bearded, old, white, grizzled individuals. Age is revered, and there's really no use in Chinese society for young men other than as soldiers. The goddesses are young, but they have to be because of their beauty, of course. So, and now in Chinese religiosity, respect for one's parents, which is called Shao, is fundamental, and it's absolutely the most important thing. We have a quote here from Confucius where he says, "Master Meng said, which is the greatest duty? Duty to parents is the greatest. Among our many duties, the duty of serving the parents is fundamental. In fact, unfiliality toward one's parents was punishable by death." And I'll read this paragraph from Lawrence Thompson's book on Chinese religion, where he says that we can understand the full implications of Shao, filial piety, by noting what sorts of behavior were indictable. The grounds for such an accusation were the prosecution or cursing of one's grandparents or parents, not living with grandparents or parents and separating one's property from theirs, failure to support one's grandparents or parents, marrying, entertaining, or ceasing to observe mourning before the end of the required mourning period, concealing a parent's death, and falsely announcing a grandparent's or parent's death. So we can see here that the Chinese civilization took filial piety very seriously. Now, the course of such a civilization in which the reverence is given toward the elders and toward the revered dead is a civilization, of course, that's oriented toward the past. And its natural orientation toward technological innovation is going to be a conservative attitude, of course. And of course, as Feng Yulan remarks in his History of Chinese Philosophy, the way of life of the farmers is to follow nature. They admire nature, like the Yangshao farmers. They admire nature and condemn the artificial, and in their primitivity and innocence, they are easily made content. They desire no change, nor can they conceive of any change. In China, there have been not a few notable inventions or discoveries, but as Feng Yulan remarks here, we often find that these were discouraged rather than encouraged. So now, we have to ask, I think, how it is that this Chinese attitude toward conservation squares with Joseph Needham's picture of China as the great rival to the West in terms of the civilization of its innovations and its inventions. The idea of, the Chinese inventing gunpowder and paper and mechanical clocks and the movable press. We have this idea of China as being as nearly as technologically precocious as the West. So how then does Needham's picture that he popularized of China as the great technological civilization square with this idea of it also being the civilization which has the strongest, or at least one of the strongest, cults of respect for the revered dead? And I think what we'll see here as we go through the evolution of the society, we'll figure this out. This will be a central antinomy that we'll then address ourselves to, and we'll find the answer to as we look at the cult of the dead here. Let's start with a consideration then of the royal tombs of Anyang. Anyang is already coming in, even though it dates back to the Shang dynasty about 1200 BC. It's coming already at the end of a very long development. At the site of Anyang, there's a city called Xiaomentun, which is laid out on the southern bank of the Huan River along a north-south axis. All Chinese cities are laid out on north-south axes, and for the Chinese, the underworld is in the north. It's the exact opposite of where it was for the Indian civilization, where the underworld was in the south. For China, the underworld and the realm of the dead is in the north, and consequently, all the houses and gates and entrances and temples face south, so that evil spirits don't happen to wander in or be blown in from the north and inadvertently enter into your house. So they're all organized this way. So at the city of Xiaomentun, there's a famous cemetery of Shipei Kang, which lies upriver on its northern side. The north is the direction of the dead. That's why it's on the northern bank. And at this cemetery, it had 11 royal graves and a bunch more than 1,000 really smaller graves. But it's these 11 royal graves that we want to look at here of these rulers. The tombs of these graves were cruciform in shape, and they're oriented along a north-south axis. There are long ramps on the northern and southern sides. Tomb 1001 forms a pit about 10 meters deep with slightly sloping walls. The mouth of the pit is 19 meters long north to south, 14 meters wide. A ramp leads from the ground to the bottom of the grave pit on each of the 4 sides. The southern ramp, which is the longest, measures about 30 meters. Inside the pit, a central wooden chamber was built, and the primary coffin of the tomb would have been placed inside, in the center of the grave. The coffin was placed on a raised platform of white stone carved with tigers, owls, and oxen, and around the body, 9 human guards and 9 dogs had been sacrificed in the center, in each corner, and in each of the cardinal directions. 10 severed human heads were placed in neat rows along the tomb's 4 stairways, and along the southern ramp there was a chariot and 4 horses with fittings of bright bronze, together with 3 more men. Each of these men held a knife, a dagger axe, and a bow with 10 arrows, and the tomb was furnished with stone sculptures, jade, shell, bone, antler, teeth, bronzes, and pottery. These tombs, like the royal tombs of Ur, though, were robbed, and so what has been found in them is merely a fraction of what was there to begin with. But now, these tombs are dug down into the earth. And so the idea is that the dead ruler is being returned together with all his possessions to the realm of the Yellow Springs, which the Chinese believe lay just underneath the earth. And according to Marcel Grenet, they also believe that the souls of the dead, these Po souls, would be carried along underground rivers from which they would be released in the springtime along the main river arteries of China, where the spring rituals of women bathing naked in the rivers might then pick up their souls for rebirth. So these tombs then are to be imagined as elaborate wells dug down to the Yellow Springs in order to send the dead along their way into the veins and arteries of the various underground river systems. In China, rather interestingly, the water systems are clouded with the microbes of dead souls. So that's the symbolism of these tombs. Now, there's one tomb in particular in the city of Shaotun. There was found a royal burial of a woman named Fu Hao, who was the consort of one King Wu Ding. Her grave was completely intact, so it's worth considering because it hadn't been plundered for what was actually in these graves. And the scale's nowhere near the size of those at the Shipekang cemetery, but it gives us some idea of what those others must have been like. The tomb chamber, from it were recovered more than 1,600 objects, 7,000 cowrie shells, 440 bronzes, 590 jades, 560 bone objects, in excess of something like 70 stone objects, and 3 seashells. Now you find jade figurines, jade carvings. Those begin to come in during the period of the Lungshan culture, which had been a culture of militarists that came in and conquered the Yangshao culture. And in their graves, they start putting lots of jade trinkets. And jade, it was thought, prevents the body from decaying. So this is why so much jade is put into these tombs, because it's thought to have these magical properties. And they also put cinnabar in these tombs instead of as a substitute for the old tradition of red ochre. Now notice that she has in her tomb 440 bronzes. These bronze vessels are the main thing during the Shang dynasty. They are the key thing. They are bronze vessels that are in the shape of animals such as tigers and dragons and various animals, and they are regarded as carrying the shaman, the soul of the shaman, into the other world, where the shaman then can communicate with the dead. So it was very essential to have them, and the Chinese states at this time tended to go to war over the possession of these bronze vessels. So he who had, like the rings in Tolkien, he who had access to these bronze vessels could communicate directly with the dead. So that's why we always find them in these graves of royalty. So it's very important to have them. And so they're means of communicating with the dead. And as time goes by, though, the cult of the dead begins to weaken, and the tradition of the bronzes begins to migrate into two directions, the artistic traditions of them. In one direction, the animal iconography comes off of the vessels, and they become carved as separate bronze tigers, bronze lions, and so forth. that eventually devolved to the level of objet d'art from about 600 BC or thereabouts. Then by the time you get down to the Han Dynasty, they start turning up these animals in the great tombs of the Han Dynasty, where they become transformed into sculptures of the great animals that guarded the gateways and entrances to the tombs. So they do find their way back to the cult of the dead eventually. But meanwhile, the bronze ritual vessel itself, without the animals on them, separated and went on its own way, its own pathway, and they became also these little, first they became large, what are called Hu vessels during the Eastern Zhou dynasty, on which separate registers depict humans hunting animals or otherwise engaged in battle scenes. By the time of the Warring States period, though, which is 480 to 220 BC, they have devolved into mere bronze dings and flasks, which are ornamented with abstract geometric designs, inlaid with silver, and which have lost all symbolic connection to the animal forms that originally adorned their surfaces. So what has happened here is that the most important paraphernalia in the cult of the dead during the Shang dynasty were these bronze vessels, and now they have split and devolved, and something has happened to make this happen, a ripple through the cult of the dead. A seismic tremor has taken place that has brought this about. And indeed, we do find in the spring and autumn period, in the middle of the 8th century, beginning about in the middle of the 8th century BC, we start getting a weakening in the ancient cult of the ancestors that begins to set in. And by the time we get to the period of the contending states in the 5th century BC, we begin to get a period of massive technological change. Now, if we rewind and we look at the history of Chinese civilization, the period that extends from 3000 to 600 BC is the most stable in its history. It's a period of very, very little technological change, indeed changes of any sort whatsoever. This is the period when Chinese civilization comes into being as a high Bronze Age culture, but its birth follows very different lines from what we found when we were looking at the evolution of the cities in Mesopotamia, where we found a cascade of technological innovations. The rise of China as a high civilization was decisively not accompanied by a similar series of technological achievements, but rather by a more gradual elaboration of already persistent culture forms. Now, the Longshan culture that I mentioned that began to develop in eastern China from out of the region of the Shandong Peninsula dates to 3000 to 2000 BC. This was a society of militarists which began to attack the earlier Yangshao farming cultures. And with the Longshan, they bring in we start finding in the tombs from the Longshan period, in addition to these jade implements that I mentioned, lots of weapons start appearing, and the custom of cutting off heads and the custom of scalping, which seems to have originated during this time. And we start finding villages and settlements now with walls around them. So civilization is beginning to come into being here in a big way. And it is from the period of about 2000 BC, once we have our two cultures, in this case the Yangshao and the Longshan, which fuse together, long about 2000 BC, this is the time when the legendary Xia dynasty was supposed to have flourished. And indeed, archaeologists have found the remains of a culture at the site of Erlido, which fits roughly into about the same time frame and occupies about the same geographical region as the Xia was thought to have done. Now, bronze working was a standard at Erlido, and bronze ritual vessels were already being made, though they didn't have the animal art decorating them. There was no writing yet, at least none that survived. But there was, in place of the animals on the vessels, there was a developed art of bronze plaques laid out on the ground that were inlaid with turquoise tiles, which make up animal shapes, such as foxes and tigers. Now, once those animal shapes on the ground are combined with the bronze vessels, then we get the coveted Shang dynasty rituals for communicating with the dead that take place during the Shang dynasty. Now, so the Erlido culture seems to correspond to about the Xia dynasty. And this is a culture, though, of very little technological change. It's basically inherited the world of the farmers, and it's added bronze in there, but there's not much else going on. There's simply an elaboration into higher, more developed, and more beautiful art styles. And as K.C. Chang remarks, no significantly new technological innovation has been archaeologically documented from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. The same stone, bone, shell, and presumably wooden digging, earth-turning, weeding, and harvesting implements were used during both periods. The emergence of Bronze Age civilizations in China was not accompanied, insofar as our archaeological record suggests, by a significant use of metal farming implements, irrigation networks, any use of draft animals, or the use of the plow. So for a breakthrough in agricultural technology in China, we will have to wait until about 500 or 600 BC when cast iron began to be used widely for agricultural implements. So for about a period of 2,500 years, we have a civilization existing technologically at about the same unchanging level of development. So they had no, the bronze ritual vessels of Erlido became the Shang Dynasty bronzes once they were crossed with the animal art from the turquoise plaques. The central buildings, which had been located always in the middle of a town or a village in the Neolithic, are now expanded to a larger size during the period of Erlido in order to create the first palaces. The graves become more and more elaborate until by the time of Anyang, they achieve their pinnacle of development. But the same wooden farming tools that were used by Yangshao farmers were also used by Zhou farmers, who, like their Neolithic forebears, had no use for irrigation, the plow, or draft animals. There are furthermore few, if any, gadgets that we later associate with China, like magnetic compasses, mechanical clocks, and guns. None of that is there. So what happened then? We have to ask what happened then that changes this from a conservative civilization to become a civilization of technological innovation. And indeed, what happened was that the cult of the ancestors became enfeebled as the result of a change in China's political situation during the period of the contending states. A change that had actually begun to set in roughly in the middle of the 8th century during the spring and autumn period, when these feudal princes rose up and they overthrew the Zhou capital in the west and they moved it to Luoyang in the east. These feudal princes were more concerned with their own aggrandizement than with tradition, and they were more interested in asserting the powers of their own local regional states than in worshiping Zhou ancestors. So, as Mark Edward Lewis comments, ancestral worship, the primary state cult of the Shang and the Zhou, was supplanted in the warring states by cults to cosmic divinities or important natural sites, especially mountains and rivers. So what happened was, during this period when these feudal princes are rising into power, about 700 BC, there's a break in the traditions of respect for the revered dead and the ancestors, and instead there's a shift to heavenly powers. Qin is the heaven, and there's a shift to heavenly powers where we start getting altars out in the open that are directed to cosmic deities now, rather than to, which tend to aggrandize the powers of the rulers, rather than to the revered dead. And long about this time, sure enough, 600 to 500 BC, with the weakening of this cult, we start getting a technological creative explosion. This is really the fifth of our creative singularities that we went looking for here, where we have a weakening of a mortuary cult with a sudden expansion of a technological tradition. About 600 to 500 BC, the first bronze agricultural tools appear, as well as the first cast iron and steel tools, including the use of the iron plow. Irrigation is introduced at this time, as is metal coinage. We have all sorts of inventions: an improved iron sword, a new kind of body armor, the invention of the crossbow. And in the 4th century BC, we have the earliest use of the magnetic compass, another famous Chinese invention. We have the trace harness, which enables draft animals to pull plows, and so forth and so on. So the thing about these technologies that come into being is that now what has to happen in a cult that's dominated by the ancestral dead is that the new technologies have to be reascribed back to the original ancestors. And so there's a kind of falsification of history that begins to take place here. Yu the Great, for instance, the founder of the Xia dynasty, whom tradition ascribes to about the year 2205 BC, was supposed to have invented irrigation, but we've just seen that the Chinese did not use irrigation prior to the 6th century. Huangdi, who was supposed to have lived even earlier than Yu, is the supposed inventor of the magnetic compass. He was supposed to have lived to about 2600 BC, but we just saw that the magnetic compass didn't come into use until the 4th century BC. Shen Nung, the god of agriculture, who lived around 2800 BC, was thought to have invented the plow, although again, we just saw the plow come into being much later on. So, in a society that is dominated by the cult of the ancestors, ancient myth has to be redrafted in order to make it look like new inventions were actually there all along by ascribing them to the ancient ancestor figures in a kind of falsification of history. And this is how technological change does take place, when it takes place in these kinds of societies. Now, as Nietzsche remarks somewhere in one of his notebooks, a preponderance of mandarins indicates that something has gone wrong in a society. I think that no period of trouble was ever more conspicuous than the age of the Warring States period, 480 BC in China, that produced so many philosophers that it's become known as the Age of the Hundred Schools. And of course, the two great philosophers that came out of that tradition, amongst many others, but the two greatest were Confucius and Lao Tzu, and I want to turn to look briefly at them. Confucius was really the first archaist. That's the thing about him. He had not the slightest intention of introducing anything new or teaching anything new. He says, I transmit, but do not innovate. I am truthful in what I say and devoted to antiquity. So observe how anxious he is to deny innovation as a means of asserting his authenticity, since this presupposes that originality was not something valued by the Chinese. In fact, Confucius's model for an ideal society then was to go back to the ways of the Western Zhou time, which was the period in which filial piety, ancestor worship, and an unquestioning obedience to the ways of authority went without saying. And the main thing, too, about Confucius was the whole idea of Ren, or humanity, benevolence, and also Li, following the customs and laws of tradition, the rites of marriage, the funeral rites, ancestor worship. All these should be performed by the ideal gentleman, the so-called chunzu, because in doing so, this behavior upholds the social fabric. Now, the irony of this is that Confucius did not believe in gods, spirits, or ancestors. So already by his time, we have the irony of a man who is an axial age prophet. So we've come into the period here of Jasper's axial age only in China, who now is advocating upholding the rites, upholding tradition, following the rituals, but he no longer believes in them. His philosophy is simply a kind of pragmatism, and he was condemned by Motsu for this. Motsu was a warrior general who conversely believed in the reality of the spirits but had no use for the rituals of the sacrifice. So he was one of Confucius's greatest antagonists. And so, as we read in the Analects, Zhu Kung wanted to do away with the sacrificial sheep at the announcement of the new moon. The master said, Zhu, you are loath to part with the price of the sheep, but I am loath to see the disappearance of the right. So upholding the rites of tradition, paying one's respects to the spirits and the gods while keeping them at a distance is the central thing in Confucian philosophy, upholding the rights of the state. And so as an axial age philosopher, his solution is simply to follow the state and uphold the social fabric, which presupposes, of course, that it was already disintegrating and falling apart, as all the axial age prophets are responses to an age of cultural disintegration. But then the primary enemy of Confucius, though, was not Motsu, but Lao Tzu. And as in particularly Lao Tzu says, Lao Tzu was a cantankerous individual who hated Confucius. He says, have done with learning. And I think that when he says this, he specifically has the ideas of Confucius in mind, and you will have no more vexation. So Lao Tzu now, as an axial age prophet, turns against Confucius and the Confucian tradition, turns away from society, and heads out to the hills and mountains of nature. For according to Lao Tzu, it is precisely learning, erudition, culture, and civilization that ruin one's ability to hear the song of the cosmos, which is personified by the Tao, the great macrocosmic rhythm that one should put oneself in. You should put oneself in harmony with. We have seen how in India, Yajnavalkya's axial age solution was to put the Atman in harmony with the Brahman, and here Lao Tzu's axial age solution is to put oneself in harmony with the Tao. And he says, when the great Tao was abandoned, there appeared humanity and justice. And of course, humanity is the translation of the word Ren, which meant benevolence, which was the decent human individual upholding the rights and laws of the state that Confucius had in mind. And here he's deliberately critiquing Confucius and turning against him. And you can see, as you read these aphorisms that you find in the Tao Te Ching, and I do believe that Lao Tzu was a real person, these aphorisms are way too cantankerous to have been just floating on the wind and picked up by tradition. There's clearly a personality involved here. And you should read these aphorisms. Some of them are dripping with sarcasm, directed, of course, at the Confucians. He says, when intelligence and wit arose, there appeared great hypocrites. When the six relations lost their harmony, there appeared filial piety and paternal kindness. So Lao Tzu now pours liquid scorn onto the fires of Confucius's whole worldview. Filial piety is a waste of time, and the cultivation of benevolence is for idiots. Drop wisdom, he says, abandon cleverness, and the people will be benefited 100-fold. Drop humanity, that's Confucius's Ren again, abandon justice, and the people will return to their natural affections. So civilization, Lao Tzu is really the first kind of Rousseauian figure, the kind of Nietzschean Socratic man who brings civilization into question, because after all, It has fallen apart. The nobles have come in as they did at the end of Old Kingdom Egypt, and they're tearing the whole society apart. One can no longer put one's faith in a social order if that social order is constantly changing and dropping out beneath one's feet. So actually, though, Lao Tzu is saying, dismiss filial piety, dismiss the state, dismiss learning, he is still a conservative nonetheless. Only his idea of conservation is really to go back to the age of the Yangshao farmers. His ideal state really is the image of the Yangshao farmer. And in fact, I'll read you what his little idea of the utopia is, and you can see it here and compare it with the life of the Yangshao farmer. He says, for a small country with a small population, though there are highly efficient mechanical contrivances, the people have no use for them. Let them mind death and refrain from migrating to distant places. Boats and carriages, weapons and armor there may still be, but there are no occasions for using or displaying them. Let the people revert to communication by knotting cords. So he even wants to do away with writing and revert back to communicating by putting knots in cords. This is an ultra-conservative on the model of Akhenaten. See to it that they are contented with their food, pleased with their clothing, satisfied with their houses, and inured to their simple ways of living. Though there may be another country in the neighborhood so close that they are within sight of each other, and the crowing of cocks and barking of dogs in one place can be heard in the other, yet there is no traffic between them, and throughout their lives, the two peoples have nothing to do with each other. That's Lao Tzu's utopia. That's his vision of a rejection of society, going back to the ways of the farmers, going back to the ways of the ancestors, and he is even more radically conservative than Confucius is. So the way of life of the Yangshao farmer then, textured by serrated leaves and tree bark, fish scales, and the smell of horse dung, was what Lao Tzu preferred. And these are the kinds of fractal edges and ridged patterns which he regarded as instructive, not the smooth surfaces of characters littering silk texts like the patterns of a bird's wet feet across cloth. So that really brings us to the end of the axial age here. And we can see Lao Tzu, like Gilgamesh, turning his back on the city, like Yajnavalkya turning his back on the Brahmins. We can see Lao Tzu turning his back on the social order in the axial age and offering the individual the tools of his own self-salvation, just as Yajnavalkya had when he had introduced yoga. So Lao Tzu introduces the way of following the Tao, going out into nature and following the way of the Tao there. After the axial age in India had come down and was resolved in the creation of the first empire there under the warrior Emperor Ashoka, who created the Maurya dynasty. Here too, 200 BC, and at just about the same time, the same thing happens in China, where we get under Qin Shi Huangdi the creation now of China's first empire, 220 BC, and this is the ultimate solution that the axial age offers now. And Qin Shi Huangdi is something of a, I don't want to go into too much detail on him now, but he is something of a, he turns his back on all the traditions of ancestor worship. He takes Lao Tzu's advice even further and even goes to war against the realm of the mind in general by instituting his big book burnings. The Great Wall is built during his time, and Chinese society is completely recoded and reoriented in a massive technological explosion that's even bigger than what happened in the 6th century BC, where a new system of standardized weights and measures is introduced, new kinds of city layouts, the first tall buildings are really introduced, new kinds of coinage, new forms of standardized writing. All of this stuff is introduced, and the whole cult of the ancestors is dismissed and regarded as illegal by the legalist philosophies and principles of Qin Shi Huangdi. And he really became something similar to Chinese civilization as to what Akhenaten had become. He becomes the troubling figure that troubles the subsequent conscience of the Chinese civilization. But after him, the technological explosion continues to accelerate in China, and more inventions start creeping along, although they come in very slowly, bit by bit over time, because the Chinese, because they have such respect for the cult of the dead and the revered ancestors, have a very hard time. They always have they're always thinking twice about things. They're always troubled by the conscience. And the sting of conscience is, of course, the cult of the ancestral dead that on Halloween we give our children treats to make the dead go away. That's what that symbolizes. And, after the flourishing of Chinese philosophy for 3 centuries, the Qin then turn around and they order a massive burning of the books. So it's like they open the door to technological change, and then they think better of it and quash it. After welcoming Buddhism into their civilization, they turn around once more, and by the 9th century AD, they start going around burning all the Buddhist temples and decide they don't want Buddhism. In the 15th century, the Emperor Yongle sends Zheng He's fleet on a fleet of ships on a series of 7 voyages in order to map out the entire globe. But when Yongle's son, the Hongji Emperor, ascends the throne, he then turns right around and orders an end to these expeditions, even authorizing the destruction of records of the voyages as though they had never even taken place. So the root of the Chinese hesitation regarding all things new stems in the long, long tradition, beginning with the Yangshao farmers, of deferring to the ancient ancestral elders and hence to tradition and the past. And so we arrive at the solution to our antinomy, where Needham had popularized the image of a technologically precocious and innovative civilization, but it's really later China that is the case, and it's never the case that innovation was favored and encouraged. It always was the exception in China. Whereas the early period, when China was dominated by its cult of the ancestral dead from 3000 BC, or let's say 5000 BC even, down to the Spring and Autumn period, 600 BC, is the period when technological change hardly happens at all. And it only does so once the warriors and princes of the Western Zhou period begin going to war with each other and tearing up the social fabric, and the polis begins to dissipate and disappear. That change begins to happen and technology begins to take place. And we get all the new stuff, irrigation, the plow, coinage, bronze agricultural tools, and all of that starts happening and taking place. So that is, in a nutshell, the evolution of Chinese history in terms of its interplay between the cult of the dead and the relationship between technology.